Western expansion didn't happen the way movies or modern rewrites like to present it. It wasn't a nonstop parade of lone men forever, and it wasn't some moral the transformation the moment families arrived. It actually happened. What actually happened was far more practical. People went west for opportunity. Some went west to test whether the land, routes, and resources were even worth the effort. Others followed once staying made sense. That's not ideology. That's how humans have always expanded into unknown territory. So today we are talking about Western women and families. Welcome to our republic.
When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political band,
sailors and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force.
Well, I think it's time we ask ourselves if we still know the freedoms that were intended for us by the founding fathers. Not one small step for man.
Those three hallowed words reverently dictate what you ought to be, what you can be, what you will be.
we pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
When I first started doing research for women in the West, most of the resources I found were it was liberal trash. I'm just going to say it, right? What it was saying is that criminal men were expanding west, and the only thing that saved the West was women because they came and calmed the men down. And it was absolutely ridiculous. So that's why we're doing Western women and families, because that's the reality of how it worked, right? It wasn't just Western women coming and rescuing men. It was the need for families to settle the frontier. And early frontier activities revolved around work that was risky, temporary, and uncertain. Mining, cattle drives, railroads, freight routes, surveying, none of that was designed for permanence. It was designed to answer that basic question: is this place worth committing to? Those jobs pulled in men first because they required mobility, tolerance for danger, and the ability to leave quickly if things collapsed. A mining camp wasn't a town. A cattle trail wasn't a neighborhood. These were testing grounds, not end goals. And sometimes the answer was yes, and sometimes it was no. Either way, someone had to find out. Now, once families began arriving, frontier communities started to look different because the needs were different. Temporary shelters gave way to housing that could survive winters. Schools appeared because children needed education, whether anyone felt the need for it already or not. Churches and civic buildings showed up because communities required meeting places, record keeping, and organization to function year after year. This didn't make the frontier life easier, it just made it structured. Places built around short-term labor adapt differently than places built for long-term residents. That shifted how towns operated and how people planned, not because anyone became morally superior or because women came and saved men, but because permanence demanded it. Life for women and families on the frontier was constant work. Food had to be grown, preserved, and stored. Clothing had to be made, repaired, and reused. Water had to be hauled. Fuel had to be gathered. Illness had to be handled with limited supplies and limited help. There was no backup system. If something failed, the household dealt with it. Planning mattered. Forgetting something mattered. Running out of something mattered. Right? This wasn't romantic independence. It was full-time management in an environment that didn't give a crap. Frontier families worked because they had to. Running a farm, ranch, or business required continual labor across many tasks. Trying to do it alone was inefficient and usually short-lived. Marriage functioned as a practical partnership, not a sentimental abstraction or women needing to change men or men needing to be rescued. It's garbage. I'm telling you, that is most of what I found when it comes to women in the frontier. Children contributed early because survival required it. Education existed, but it worked around seasons, weather, and labor needs. But the frontier didn't pause because it was time for a schoolhouse lesson. Households that stayed organized tended to last. Households didn't usually disappear quietly. And Western women were not a single group with a single experience. They were homesteaders, ranchers, merchants, teachers, shopkeepers, and business owners. Some ran boarding houses, some managed farms or ranches, while husbands were gone for months working railroads or cattle driving or mining. Immigrant women from Europe, Asia, and Latin America brought different backgrounds, but the daily demands were the same. The land had to be worked, families had to be fed, and businesses had to function. Widowhood was common due to disease, accidents, and frontier hazards. And when it happened, women usually assumed control of households and property because the work didn't stop. There was no ceremony attached to it. They just did the work. It was a family. It was a unit. They worked together. As family populations increased, towns developed institutions that supported long-term life. Right? Schools organized educations, churches handled religious life and doubled as meeting spaces. Local governments recorded land claims, resolved disputes, and kept track of property. These systems reduced instability and made cooperation cheaper than conflict. And that mattered in places where distance and isolation amplified every problem. Towns that invested in institutions tended to survive longer than those that didn't. The records, land deeds, school rolls, town charters, they make that pattern clear. As communities stabilized, legal systems adapted. Property rules, inheritance laws, and local government expanded because families needed clarity and continuity. Western territories adjusted to these systems faster than some eastern states because circumstances demanded it. The Wyoming Territory granted women the vote in 1869, reflecting its approach. Lawmakers believed that it would attract settlers and encourage families to stay, stabilizing communities. It was a practical decision aimed at growth, not at saving men. The West adopted and it worked. Families work, right? Families come together and work. Settlements built only around transitional labor often faded once resources ran out or routes shifted. Communities with families invested in land, education, and institutions tended to remain. Once people planned beyond the next season, towns stopped being temporary. Railroads, courts, and business followed settled populations. Infrastructure went where people committed long term, and that pattern repeated everywhere across the West. Yes, the men came in to see if it was worth it, but when the women and the family came, it was then settled. Western women and families were part of the settlement phase of American expansion. As opportunity became stable enough to support long-term life, families committed to the land, built homes, established schools, churches, and local governments, and created the continuity that allowed frontier communities to endure beyond a single boom or a season. Right? Their role is recorded in land deeds, town charters, institutions, and the survival of communities that became permanent parts of the United States. They played that role. They did, but they weren't there to just rescue men. I really appreciate you taking the time to listen. Remember, history isn't boring. It's the record of Western women and families living and working alongside the men who opened the frontier, turning temporary places into permanent American communities. See you next time.